Welcome to the Kalinga Literary Festival's Bhava Samvad. I am delighted to introduce this session on Rahul Soni's translation of Shrikant Verma's iconic poetry collection, Magadh. Shrikant Verma was a renowned journalist who later joined the Congress Party in 1976. Despite his active engagement in politics, he retained an enduring fascination with the inner workings of power, and he kept coming back to it in his poems. First published in Hindi in 1984, Verma's Magadh has established itself as a key work of late 20th century Indian poetry. It remains one of the most iconic and influential Indian poetry collections ever published, and readings of and discussions on the poems are still organized on a regular basis. Reading this remarkable compilation of poetry, masterfully translated, we are confronted with an uncanny foreshadowing of our current reality. 4 decades later, these poems speak to our time more than ever before, speaking both archly and urgently through unreliable narrators, commoners, statesmen, wanderers, people close to power but never in power. The 56 poems in Magadh range widely in tone, from nostalgic to ironic, to bitter to sorrowful. The potency of its language, which is so economical with its use of words, matches the power of what it sets out to convey. We have with us today Rahul Soni, whose translation of Magadh into English is a revelation. He is a writer, editor, and translator. He was a Charles Wallace Visiting Fellow in Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in 2010, received the Sangam House Fellowship in 2012 and the Frankfurt Fellowship in 2022. He has edited the anthology of Hindi poetry in English translation, Home from a Distance, and translated Gitanjali Shree's novel, The Roof Beneath Their Feet, a selection of Ashok Vajpayee's poetry, A Name for Every Leaf, and Pankaj Kapoor's novella, The Peri. At present, he is associate publisher at HarperCollins India. Joining him is Daisy Rockwell. She is a painter, writer, and translator living in Verma. She holds a PhD in South Asian literature from the University of Chicago. Rockwell has published several translations from Hindi and Urdu, including Ashk's Falling Walls, Bisham Sahani's Tamas, and Khadija Mastoor's The Women's Courtyard. Her 2021 translation of Gitanjali Shree's Hindi novel Tomb of Sand went on to win the International Booker Prize and the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation in 2022. She was also awarded the 2023 Vani Foundation Distinguished Translator Award by the Vani Foundation and Teamwork Arts. We're very honored to have you both here today, Rahul and Daisy. Over to you, Daisy.
Thank you. Hello, Rahul.
Hey,
We meet
hey
again.
Daisy. We
Hi.
do after a long time. Thank you so much
Yes.
for
Yeah.
agreeing to do this. My honor, my pleasure.
Well, I'm so glad I did because it gave me a chance to read the whole book carefully, and when I, might have just dipped into it or something like that. So I've read the whole thing. And it's lovely, and I love the translations, and the printing is beautiful too. And I so many informative, like the introduction and the afterward, I like lots of wonderful informative pieces of writing that go with it. So I'm excited to talk about it. But first, I wanted to talk about more, like draw back further and talk about translation in general and your practice of it, because there's a lot of people now, because of Tomb of Sand, there's just lots of young people that are excited to start translating. And every time I do an event, they want to know like very practical, specific things. So I want to ask you a series of just very general questions about your practice, so to help the possible potential translators out there. So first of all, I was wondering, what makes you pick a project? What makes you feel like this is the thing I'm going to do?
So I've translated for various reasons, and not every project is picked for the same reason. Not all of them are internal. Some of them are external reasons. Magadh, for instance, that's the first thing I ever actually, I think, attempted to translate. and then I kept at it for many years, and a number of things happened in the interim. But that's something I decided I wanted to translate because, well, a friend had recommended this volume to me, and he thought I'd love it, and I did, and I thought there was things that I could learn from it for my own writing, and I write in English, and so just in order to try and be able to achieve those same effects in English, I started trying to write those poems in English. I didn't think of it as translation at that point.
Oh, so this was when you didn't even think of yourself as a translator.
Yeah.
Right.
Then around the same time is when I started the online journal Pratilipi, and that started out being a bilingual journal. We did Hindi and English, my co-editor and I, and it eventually fanned out into a multilingual enterprise. But a lot of translation I did there was for just that more practical purpose of, you're running a bilingual journal, you want to have as much of the, I hate the word content,
Yes.
on it in
literature.
two languages.
Literature. Yes.
Then the stuff that's commissioned, for instance, I think after reading my translations of Magadh, Ashokji, he approached me and said, would I be interested in doing a selection of his poems? And so that is how that came about. I've been working on Mirabai on and off for a while. That also came about because of Arundhati Subramaniam's suggestion that I do a few poems for her anthology. And then these kind of grabbed me and said, okay, there's something I want to explore over here. There is a voice. There's a dissatisfaction in, at least for me, with the previous translations that I have seen. So yeah, it's a variety of reasons, not just one thing that makes me pick. I mean, if I were to say what ideally it is, and if I had no external factors, it would be something that I want to learn from as a writer. I think that's how I would put it, and that's why I think Magadh is still something that I'm so fond of, even like 10 years down the line.
That's it's your origin story as a translator.
It is indeed.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So it's not like you said, I want to translate things, and then went and found a thing. It was more that something inspired you to translate.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I want to ask you a question that's come up a lot lately on Twitter because people found out that I do my first drafts by hand. So I want to know if you do write by hand any drafts, or is it all straight into the computer, or what is your actual process like that?
If I have to, again, this differs. This differs a lot from project to project. But if I have to make a generalization, I think when I write as opposed to translate, I do that by hand. And I do multiple drafts by hand before finally putting it into the laptop. With translation, often enough, I do directly work on the computer. I find it much easier to go back and revise, or easier to change. Say, if I'm working on poetry, just easier to do line breaks in a different way and try out many different things. Very quickly, as it were. But then again, if it's poetry I'm working with, sometimes I'll just start scribbling in the margins of the book or the printed text, and then move on to working on the laptop with them.
Excellent. So how many? This is something I've also talked to a lot of people about, and I think very few people realize how much we edit when we translate. So I was wondering if you have a kind of target number of how many drafts you would do.
No, I don't think I have a target number. I will edit as long as I have the chance to edit.
I mean, I'm the same way. Like the proofs come in, and I'm like, change this, change this, change this, change this.
I have done that, and yeah, 10 years on, I've made a fair few changes. I like to think they're small enough that they wouldn't have caused anyone any bother, caused the typesetter to tear their hair out.
Well,
But no, I keep continuously working on these things. I don't think I keep track of like these many revisions I've done. I read it, I make a change, I go back to it, I read a line, I
but
make a
that's
change.
more. I mean, I think with poetry, it's more possible to not keep track, right? Because there's like
That's
small
probably true.
pieces that you just keep working on and working on and working on. But with a book like a prose work,
Yeah,
you have to
that is
keep
good
going
point, actually.
more linear way through the whole thing.
That
again
is
and
true.
again and again.
Yeah. I would say on average, there's at least 5 to 6 drafts before I call it a first draft, maybe.
Before you call it, even allow it to be first. Amazing. So I wanted to ask, since you're an editor too, like, do you think that you're a good editor because you were a translator first? Or do you think you were already a good editor and that made you a good translator? And what, of course, the hidden question is, like, do you think that translation is in large part editing?
I do think they feed into each other. It's something I have thought about. Maybe not a lot, but a fair bit. And I mean, they both require you to immerse yourself in another writer's voice, work, language, and so there is that common thread through them, and they require they require you to kind of make them your own as well, so that you have that that feeling of ownership, right? When you go in and say, okay, I'm going to do this to the text, and I know it will. I know it's fair game. I know it's right, or it will turn out right, or whatever. And that sort of confidence only comes when I think you're kind of treating that text as your own. And I think that immersion in another voice, I think, is the key to both kind of roles. So I think they constantly kind of feed into each other. It's a loop. I don't think one came before the other, maybe.
Right. Right. They're just all a part of the same process in a way.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
How do you separate that? People keep asking me, well, do you get to work on your own writing? And I say, well, what if this is my own writing? And but you also have, you also call yourself a writer, which I do too sometimes, and sometimes I don't. But so feel like from what you were just saying, that you started out feeling like you were a writer before you felt that you were a translator or an editor. So how do you feel? Like you were talking about somebody else's voice. Do you think that translation is not your own writing, or how do you kind of separate those in your mind as types of writing?
Yeah, that's a tough one. More so because I don't think I've really been a writer for many years now. You need to write to be a writer, and I haven't been doing that for a while. Publishing and an editing job in publishing, I think, they tend to take a lot out of you in terms of engagement with words. It's hard to kind of move to more words after that.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think I've been calling myself a writer or translator for years until these reissues came out this year. uh, and yeah, no, I think yeah, it's hard for me to answer that. How do I separate my writing from translation? Again, I think going back to Magadh, that I feel is something that's very, very close to me, and I can almost call it like that separation maybe does not exist for me in my head here between writer and translator. Same with the Mirabai poems, for instance.
Right.
And then there's been a few others like that, off and on, over the course of like all the various little translations I've done. I think it just comes down to that: how much do I connect with it, and how much, and what is my impulse behind working on these translations? If they come from an internal compulsion of some sort, I guess it becomes linked to my own writing in my head.
Right. Right. Well, so this is a good time to ask this. I think translators love metaphors for what they do because nobody understands that well who isn't a translator. They say, but I don't understand, like, why are you always writing somebody else's books? Or like, I thought you were creative or whatever. I mean, there's all different things that people misunderstand. So translators are always have this kind of store of metaphors in my experience to explain to people. So I'd love to know what your favorite metaphor is for what you're doing as a translator.
You said you would not ask hard questions. I don't honestly have stock of metaphors for what.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, it annoys me that a lot of translation and what translators do has to it all ends up coming back to that same set of cliches very often, right? So no, I'm actually I'm very curious to hear some of the metaphors you have known and liked, and what would you
okay, I'll give you some, and then you
yeah.
can choose the one you like the best. How about that? Be like a multiple
Sounds good.
choice. Okay. A translator is like a musician, and the author is like a composer. So, for example, if you think of Bach is the author, and Yo-Yo Ma is the translator. And so, in other words, nobody says, well, I only listen to Bach playing Bach because I know that the original is far better. You can't hear Bach playing Bach because in this metaphor, this analogy, you don't know that language, right? Like, or I mean, but of course it's not perfect because Bach is dead. That's one reason why you can't hear him play. But you never say, oh, I would never listen to Yo-Yo Ma playing Bach because I only want to hear Bach playing Bach. So that metaphor is like getting at the idea that only the original is the good version, and helps underscore the idea that there's artistry involved in the interpretation and the act of interpretation. So then a metaphor I gave, that was A. B, the metaphor I gave and for the Booker website, which I just made up off the top of my head, was that it's like ballroom dancing. It's like Fred and Ginger, right? And so the author is Fred Astaire because he choreographs the dance and he sets up the shots and everything like that. And then the translator is Ginger Rogers because we have to follow exactly what Fred Astaire has set out for us, but we have to do it backwards in high heels.
That is a very good one. Yes.
Okay, and then there's number C is going to be a negative one. C is we are like Dr. Frankenstein, and we have all these we cut up all these bodies, and then we stitch them together and we reanimate it as best we can until it's like sort of lumbering in a frightening way, and then we're like, yay, I'm done with my translation and it's out in the world. Which do you pick?
It reminded me, actually, I did have one long ago when I was a translator. And that is very close to the first one, I think. I used to think of it in terms of acting, and just again that immersion in someone's head, someone's voice, and then again it leaves room for that sort of creative, I guess. I try to steer away from the word interpretation, and we'll probably get to that at some point in our conversation. But yeah, it does give
more of a reading. It's a reading.
It does leave room for being creative with a text that is, I guess, more, in some ways fixed.
So I wanted to bring up something funny that I was remembering, because you and I have both translated Gitanjali Shri, and I remembered that you had sent me, we had been talking about something else over email, and you sent me an email where you spoke briefly about that experience, and I was in the middle of translating Read Samadhi, and so I went and looked it up, and I found that I had written a reply to you and never sent it. So I just thought it would be really good to excavate. This is censored. So I'm just going to read a few lines from each of us, okay?
But you will send me that email.
I will, and I'll finally hit send, okay? This was in 2019, September of 2019. So where were you? Had you just finished? When had you finished? When did you finish that? When was it published?
It was published in 2013.
Oh, a long time after. Okay, so this was 6 years after. All right, so you said, all the very best for Great Samadhi. Can imagine how difficult that must be. Gitanjali's work, I feel, requires creating a new kind of English, which the editor and the author will then try to pull you back from. So when I actually really clearly remembered you writing that to me, and so I was kind of embarrassed that I hadn't ever sent my response, because it was meaningful. Like nobody else understood my pain at that moment, like you did. So, because I was in the middle of it, right? So then I replied, and this is censored, but I'll say, I said, to be honest, I am more worried about my own ability to create that new kind of English than the editor steamrolling me. Oh, and the copy editor, that is sure to be a nightmare. This project has given me a carpal tunnel type situation in my right index finger. I'm beginning to wonder if I really know how to translate at all. Does that sound right to you? I mean, you feel...
often there are works that I have that so affected me when I've read them in Hindi, and I've tried to kind of make them work in my English, and there's many instances where that has completely fallen flat, and I do sympathize with that and identify with it completely. Uh,
Well, I liked what you said when you said that her work requires a new kind of English, and so I thought that was actually a good segue into the work in question, because
mhm.
in a way that's what any translation asks, right? I mean,
Yeah,
she
yeah.
asks it more strongly maybe than some, but you know, like Mirabai, part, like, obviously one reason why you find the other translations wanting is because it's hard to find an English that captures
Mhm.
her work. So yeah, so I wanted you to talk a little bit about how different authors you've translated have taught you, because you hinted that you started translating Magadh because you thought it could help your own writing, because you thought
Right.
that it would teach you a new kind of English in a way. So I was wondering if you could speak about how various authors, or even just one author or this author, taught you a new way to look at English.
Um, yeah. No, with Magadh for yeah, to start with, I guess at least more than the meanings, more than the uh, contemporary resonances of the work. I think when I first read it, it was language that gripped me.
Mm-hmm.
There's something there's something very very stark, crystalline about it. It's a very limited vocabulary. It's very repetitive, um, and punctuation wise also I think he's idiosyncratic. He's minimal though, but I've always had this thing for minimalism even in writing, and uh, probably not surprising, but I am a big fan of Cormac McCarthy's work as well. um,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
but that sort of that's how writing is something that I was consciously maybe trying to work towards, um, and figure out what else I could do with that uh, purposefully limited toolkit, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Right.
and I think that is what uh, Magadh taught me. With Gitanjali, on the other hand, it's definitely not a minimal kind of language there. It's
Maximal,
completely
yes.
the opposite, and
Yeah.
and she brings in so much wordplay, so much references to a lot of cultural, uh, pop culture, even to song. Uh, there's lines in there that are purely for the sound. I mean, an editor might just say, "Okay, this is not adding anything really," but the music is so good there, right? And
Mm-hmm.
uh, it, so it was an entirely different sort of challenge there to try and figure out how to do that. More than Magadh, I think that required a very, what one might call an Indian or a very Hindi sort of English without actually becoming English. Um, so uh, yeah, with Mirabai on the other hand, I think I'm going back to the minimal kind of set there in terms of what tools I'm deploying to translate
Mm-hmm.
that. There's something very very compressed about her verse, uh, but just visually. I mean, usually when Mirabai's Pad, the verses are written out, they're like those kind of couplet form. Uh, on the page, they don't quite look that compressed. And when you translate them into English, and if you retain those sorts of line breaks,
Mm-hmm.
it absolutely doesn't work to get that kind of compressed intensity of the words. So I'm again going back to a very very short line for that, and maybe turning each line into a stanza. Uh,
So going away from the Doha kind of format.
Going away from the Doha format, the couplet format, and yeah. But with Magadh again, the other surprising thing I found in common was with E. E. Cummings in some way, actually.
Yeah.
In that Verma works with form, with standard forms a lot, actually. And they're kind of hidden behind all the unusual line breaks. And so what I found helpful, or unconsciously, I think I didn't think about it much at that point, was to kind of reconstruct those forms while doing my early drafts, so that I could get the music right, and then kind of eventually come down to then doing the line breaks according to what the final Hindi poems look like.
I feel like this, I'm jumping around in my questions here, but I feel like that A.K. Ramanujan was sort of the one who taught us that we could do this, that you can rearrange the form in order to capture the voice, that you can reimagine the shape of the poem if you need to do it. Do you think that's correct? Like, is he the, or did you just come up with it on your own?
I stumbled into it on my own, actually, and then some years later, I was talking to Arshan, and I think she pointed out that was very much like the Ramanujan way of going about it.
Right. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, my initial drafts are not faithful as they were. It's not like a line by line, word by word kind of thing. I'm trying to just loosely create a poem or a sentence or a paragraph first, and then I work my way
but
back
that's
to
the
the
key.
original.
That sentence you just said, I'm trying to loosely create a poem. Like, that's a goal in terms of translation, of wanting it to be alive in the new version. So you're creating a poem. You're not transcribing meanings diligently, from one to the other. It's creating a poem, having an end goal of that kind. I had asked you to come find this quote that you mentioned in your forward. You said, this is a process that helped me, I would like to think, approximate what A.K. Ramanujan and David Schulman have called the literal force of the text. And I wondered if you had that full quote that you could read us.
I have it. Just give me
if it's relevant.
It's interesting, certainly. And if you just give me a second, sorry about this. I have actually misspoken in my forward. It's Shulman, Narayana Rao, and Ramanujan's introduction to When God is a Customer. And the phrase is used here, but it doesn't really give anything away. So I'm quoting here. In general, we have adhered closely to the literal force of the Telugu text.
Interesting.
That's all you get over here.
But that's what I like. I like how I do this too. Like, I'll remember just a word or two that helps me, or like becomes a kind of mantra, and then if I go back and look for it, that's in a sense that was a throwaway line that was not meant to be the philosophy, of translation. But it became your philosophy.
It has in a way, actually. But there's something interesting. So when you said dig out this bit, if I can. I went to Speaking of Shiva first, and there is a really interesting bit in the introduction there, which is again something that I think I've initially unconsciously, but then also more and more consciously strived to do, which is, so here the translations are from the Kannada Vachanas, right? So I'm quoting now: not to match the Kannada with the English, not to match the Kannada with the English, but to map the medieval Kannada onto the sound look of modern English.
Oh, wow.
That
Yeah.
is, I think, very
Right? Yes, to map it. To map it. That's a really good way of thinking of it. And that's a metaphor too.
It's a metaphor. Yes.
Yes, to map it. I like that. So I had asked you also, because I think that readers know that translation is difficult, but they often don't realize what is difficult or what parts might be difficult in a particular book. And so I was hoping you could share with us the most difficult thing for you to do in Magadh, whether it's a passage or a whole way of thinking or whatever. Like what was the biggest challenge, and if possible, could you read us examples from Hindi and English?
Yes, I have been thinking about this as well. So many things just one ends up doing unconsciously, and so
Yes,
these conversations are very useful in trying to get some articulation to what was actually going on. There were a couple of poems that completely baffled me, I think, when I first approached them, and the first edition bears traces of that bafflement. They had more to do with meaning, though, I think, rather than any craft.
That's okay.
And so,
if you want to share, though.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
There's a set of poems, The Republic of Kosal, Lack of Thought in Kosal, The Style of Kosal. And The Style of Kosal is a poem that completely foxed me when I first approached it. I had no idea what was going on there. And it took me a good 10 years for the tube light, as we say, to light up finally.
Right.
So I'll read you the Hindi bit that I could not get.
Okay.
And yeah. So I won't read the whole poem. That might be too much, but just this part.
Okay.
From Kosal ki Shaili, as it's called in Hindi. इतना अवश्य कहूंगा, जो सोचता है बकता है, उसका बकना शैली बन जाता है. दुख है कौशल की अब तक शैली नहीं बन पाई. And I think what threw me was the use of the word bakna, and you'll see when I read out the earlier translation. Why that was a problem. But this much I will say. Those who think jabber on, and their gibberish becomes a style. So the word bakna becomes gibberish, or to jabber over here. Whereas I think just going back to the poems after that much distance, and of course everything that is happening around us in our world, And also in light of the earlier Kosal poems. The poem just before this is called Lack of Thought in Kosal. And that ends with the lines, Kosal can't last much longer. There's a lack of thought in Kosal. So it suddenly dawned on me that this is not gibberish we're talking about here.
No, it is. It's
But this much I will
comprehensible,
say,
right?
But this much I will say, those who think speak out. And their speaking out becomes the style. The sad thing is that Kosal still doesn't have a style of its own. And just with that kind of shift in perspective, it's actually become for me now one of the key poems, and this triptych of poems has become one of the keys in the book actually. Another example of something that I've struggled with and gone back and forth over, and this is more craft related actually. It's from the poem Dharam Yudh, which is I think one of the most powerful poems around I've ever read. I'll just say that. And that has a very, very strong rhythm in its central kind of verses. It's 113 in the first edition. Just a second. Here we are. So we have about the first third of the poem, and then we come to this passage. एक तरफा होती है हत्या, एक तरफा जय, एक तरफा दर्प, एक तरफा भय, एक तरफा विधवाएं, एक तरफा सधवाएं, एक तरफा होता है विलाप, एक तरफा संताप, एक तरफा हर्ष, एक तरफा पश्चाताप, एक तरफा होता है धर्म, एक तरफा शर्म. So just in terms of rhythm and rhyme, there's a lot going on there in those very, very short lines, right? You have the repetition of ek tarfa on going down the left hand side. You have rhymes going down the right hand side. And what I'd done in the first edition was to kind of play up the ek tarfa, the one-sided, and I translated it as one-sided the murders, one-sided the victory, one-sided the arrogance, one-sided the fear, one-sided the widows, one-sided the unwidowed, and so on. Was never quite sure about it, and even before getting to that point, I had already gone back and forth between the other option, which I finally settled for in the new edition. And that goes one-sided the murders, the victory one-sided, one-sided the arrogance, the fear one-sided, one-sided the widows, the unwidowed one-sided, one-sided the sorrow, the mourning one-sided, one-sided the joy, the repentance one-sided, one-sided the dharma, the shame one-sided. I just feel that it becomes such a more powerful rhythm because
there's much more rhythm in that.
So that might be an example of something that I have thought about a lot and struggled with, I guess.
And that sort of draws on the like an aspect of the ghazal with the radif, the repeated over and over again the same word, which is not as common in English poetry. Right. I don't think it's considered repetitive, probably. Yes. But the way that it sounded to me, that reminded me very much of the way that shairs use repetition, even if they don't necessarily, they put them in the same place. But yes, but still, it was reminiscent of that. So I had asked you also to share something that you were very proud of what you'd done, and maybe those two things were already that. But if you had another,
Oh, there's actually this one was easier for me to
okay,
answer.
pride, yes.
And there's a clever, funny, sharp little poem called "The Law" in English. It's called Niyam in Hindi, and this one I think I can just maybe go ahead and read the complete poem if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. नियम. मैं फिर कहता हूँ महाराज, मत कहें, बदला नहीं जा सकता नियम, जो दूसरों पर लागू होता है मुझ पर भी होगा. सभा को निरुत्तर करने के और भी हैं उपाय. सत्य जरूरी नहीं, सत्य का इस तरह अपव्यय उचित नहीं. निरुत्तर करना ही है सभा को तो कहें, तोड़ा नहीं जा सकता नियम, बदला जा सकता है. कहिए, हम नियम नहीं तोड़ते, सबकी तरह नियम से डरते हैं. कभी कभी बदन जब कसने लगता नागरिकों, तब हम नियम में संशोधन करते हैं. नियमों में ढिलाई की जा सकती है. And here's the English. I say again, Maharaj, do not say. The law can't be changed. What applies to others applies to me as well. There are other ways to confound the council. The truth is unnecessary. It is unwise to be prodigal with the truth. If you must, say the law can't be broken. The law can be changed. Say, I don't break the law. Like everyone, I fear it. But sometimes citizens, when it starts to smother, I make amendments. The law, after all, can be relaxed. So, I don't know if you caught on, but the second stanza is the one that I'm inordinately proud of, possibly without any good reason.
Okay.
And mostly because I finally got to use correctly the word prodigal. But I think the music of those lines also falls pretty nicely. There are other ways to confound the council. The truth is unnecessary. It is unwise to be prodigal with the truth. Yeah, no, that is something I've been dying to point out to someone.
Yes, excellent. I always feel like people don't seem to understand what the really big things are, that they'll just keep quoting something else, from some other, like, why aren't you concerned about this? Yes. So yes, I think, and also, just on a side note, I feel like it's I think in conferences and festivals, there's this lack of understanding that translators like to read their work too.
Yes. Indeed.
Yes, so that we like to read it, we want to read it, and because of the misunderstanding that it's not like creative, or it's not our writing or something like that. That it's, but actually we've worked so hard that we really, really want somebody to notice and hear the beautiful things that we put together.
And pay attention.
Pay attention, please. Gregory Rabasa, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's translator, he had this, well, he apparently said something which he never wrote down, but that is always quoted by other people, so it must be something he said in lectures a lot. He said, when I look at my translations, I always find something wrong, like I always keep editing and stuff. But when I look at my own writing, after a few drafts or whatever, I think, well, that fellow sure had the right idea. And I wondered if that quote rings true to you.
Not at all, actually. Yeah. I think when I'm translating, I do have a sense of what needs to be said, and what to approach, perhaps. With my own writing, I have no clue. And so what takes shape is it happens when I'm writing. It happens on the page, and it's often at least in the initial drafts beyond one's control sometimes, and those sometimes turn out to be the best parts when a story or a character just goes out of hand and does something that you're not expecting them to do.
Does it own something. On the other hand, you're the guy who just reissued a book of poems and totally re-edited the whole thing, right?
Not totally.
I'm thinking that you're also somebody that can never stop editing their
I'm sure
translations.
that there's things that you grow out of. There's things that it seemed like a good idea 10 years ago that don't now. You hopefully become better at your craft. Yeah, I don't know. I'll send you a copy of the old edition as well, and you can tell me how I've ruined the new one.
No, I would do the same thing. I recently accidentally had this situation where I had I converted Falling Walls into a Word format because I had to send something somewhere, and I immediately went in and started, and then I got so depressed, this will never end. I had to stop myself. I decided not to send it to the thing.
Yeah, where does it end with a project as big as that?
Right, exactly. It's not a single poem, it's like
yeah. No, I have it easy. Yeah. And that's why I prefer working with poems more than prose. Actually, it just is. You can get in and get out. A poem will take
yes.
You spend a few hours on it, move on, come back to it a few days later.
It's like, for another metaphor, it's like a skirmish as opposed to a war, right?
Yes, or a sprint as opposed to long distance.
That's less violent.
That's less violent. Yes.
I was imagining First World War, Joanne's wading through the swamps in France, and yeah.
Yes, and that's actually much more apt. Maybe even a clash of civilizations thrown in there for good measure.
Yeah. Because people are often saying that that's one school of thought is that translation is violence. Which would you care to comment on that?
I don't know. No, I don't think I've thought of it as a violent process.
Clearly, you've been veering away from all my violence metaphors. So
yeah. I mean, it's very likely that some of the authors I've translated might want to go back to the violence and say, okay, you wreaked some havoc here with your translation.
Yes,
but no, I like to think of it in much tamer kind of terms. I think solitary creative endeavor.
Yes, it's just a communion with the text.
With the text, yes. Yes, as opposed to the author, which can go both ways, I think.
That's actually funny because I picked out this quote from the introduction, not yours, but the Apurvanand's, where he said, "As it happens, speaking of Shrikant Verma, as it happens, his reputation came between the poem and the readers, and I know that. I mean, we know that this is because of his role in the Congress Party and the emergency and so on like that. But I also thought it was sort of an apt way to think about, for translators, the way that we think about authors too, that sometimes like there's this death of the author thing where we feel like now it's our turn, and so if the author, like working with Gitanjali for me was the first time where I had a living author that could read what I was doing, and I'd always fantasized that if my author was alive, they would help me with this and they would help me with that. And of course, often I'd ask her a question and she would be just as baffled as I was, or she would say, well, I have no idea, or say something even more confusing about it. And so, I loved this quote, or this idea of an author coming between their work and their readership, even if that had a particular political import.
No, that does tend to happen, but I've had good experiences there as well. It's not like as in jest we'd like to make out to be. And again, I think a good literary author is very attuned to sound, and I think that is something that is very important to me as well. And something maybe I like to think I've learned might be too presumptuous, but got or became attuned to because of Joyce, perhaps. Is this attention to sound, and I think that's where I've found authors' inputs very, very valuable. Often, whether it was with Tirohit, Gitanjali Shree's Tirohit, or with, say, Pankaj Kapoor's Dopehri. That's where I found, I think, their inputs most valuable, just in terms of helping me with the soundscape. As well, now we have another Ramanujan quote here.
Yes, the soundscape. Yes, which I think is so huge in translation, that understanding how sound is working, both in terms of the musicality of the language, but also the actual sound, like in a novel or something. What's the way things sound forms the experience that we're reading. I think that they're going to try to kick us off here now.
I believe so.
I told you we could just keep talking. We live us 3 hours. And we'll
I think
going.
We've just started.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Rahul and Daisy, for this absolutely insightful session. I only hope more metaphors keep coming forth as both of your wonderful and rigorous works of translation. Thank you again, and all the very best.
Thank you so much, Daisy, and thank you, Sonal, and also KLF for having us here.
Yes, thank you for inviting us. This was great fun. Bye.
Bye.